History as it happens, July 4th, 2023. Our Radical Declaration, Part 2.
They were brave. They stayed brave through all the bloodshed of the coming years. Their courage created a nation built on a universal claim to human dignity, on the proposition that every man, woman, and child had a right to a future of freedom. For just a moment, let us listen to the words again. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
For plebeians and politicians alike, the Declaration of Independence contains the most recognizable words in American history, a source of egalitarian inspiration that transcends time. But at the time the Declaration was drafted, the Continental Congress was absorbed with more earthly matters than debating Enlightenment philosophy. They had a war to win, a nation to create, and politics to deal with. That's next with Jack Rakove as we report History as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
The real purpose of the Declaration was to, in effect, say that, we're going ahead with the project of political independence. To secure that project, we need an alliance and support from four nations, France being far and away the most important. We need to organize new governments, including not just constitutions at the state level, but articles of confederation to give the national government a working framework of union. So the right of equality that was first and foremost on the mind of Thomas Jefferson and all his colleagues in the Continental Congress was the collective right of Americans as a people, having been subjected to a long train of abuse of their liberties, to finally throw off the yoke of obedience to King George III and the British Empire that he represented, and to secure among the nations of the earth the lawful place to which Americans were entitled.
When it came time for the revolutionaries to make the final break, to rightfully renounce their subjection to the mother country, historian Jack Rakove writes in the beginnings of national politics, the Continental Congress spent little time pondering the principles and charges that Thomas Jefferson eventually enumerated in the Declaration of Independence. What did trouble the delegates, Rakove writes, were more pragmatic questions about the necessity, utility, and timing of a formal declaration. They were concerned with its hard political consequences. And again, that is Jack Rakove in his 1979 book. So while the magisterial opening paragraphs of the document continue to ring in our hearts and minds today, Jefferson and his fellow revolutionaries must have wondered if they would succeed at all. I mean, these were scary times. The British were landing thousands of troops in New York, and in the following campaign, General Washington's army would barely escape. The Congress in Philadelphia also grappled with the question of whether the colony should create new legal governments, which would also be seen as a final break from Great Britain. Public opinion was split, inflation was soaring, there were a lot of day-to-day problems to deal with. So it's not unreasonable to wonder, what if our revolution had failed? Most revolutions do fail, right? The Declaration of Independence, the most recognizable document in our history, might be a footnote. Maybe the colonies would have gained their independence anyway decades later. It is impossible to know what might have happened, so it is better to talk about what actually did happen, while reminding ourselves that nothing was inevitable or foreordained. Our founders were not gods or demigods. They were men. They were politicians. But recognizing this hardly diminishes the world historical importance of what they achieved and the ideas that motivated their actions. This is the second in a three-part series on our Radical Declaration. Please make sure you catch Part 1 with Sean Wilentz and Jim Oakes. Jack Rakove is Emeritus Professor of History and Political Science at Stanford. He is an eminent scholar of the American founding. Jack Rakove, welcome back.
Happy to be here again.
Happy Independence Day, I guess.
Back in the day, I would have given a patriotic oration somewhere. So this is the next best thing.
Well, you can do that right now, I suppose. So the beginnings of national politics, one of your first books. And I'm glad you recommended this because although these topics, the revolution, July 4th, the Declaration, are familiar subjects, any American who has any schooling can cite the document's most famous words, right? Although it's all very familiar, reading your book reminded me of things I'd simply forgotten. the pragmatic, prosaic, concrete concerns that occupied the minds of the revolutionaries at the Continental Congress. Because wouldn't you say, Jack Rakove, that the most common way or popular way we view the Declaration today is as an ideological document? Do you agree with that? And part two of the question, although you can answer these separately. Did the authors believe they were writing for the ages at the time?
Well, it's one of the main arguments of my book. I should say one of the main themes of my book is I don't say much about the Declaration of Independence per se as a classic or seminal text. There's a vast literature on that subject which approaches it from a variety of perspectives, including deeply philosophical ones. When I wrote that book, I was essentially writing a political history of the Continental Congress, and the question of whether or when and how to declare independence was essentially a political decision. So what I set out to do in that book was to explain what made that decision possible and what were the parameters, what was the context, what were the concerns, what were the reservations, what were the ambitions. So the Declaration as a text, at least when I was a young man starting out in the trade, was not of great concern to me. But it's certainly true that any historian of American political culture, broadly defined, since at least, well, let's say 1790, would have to recognize that the Declaration and perhaps the Gettysburg Address, and I might add Lincoln's second inaugural, are in many respects the dominant political texts of our political culture.
Yeah, I often wonder how often people go back and actually read these documents that most of us have to read at some point in grammar school, high school, college, whatever. I mean, the Declaration is not a very long document. It just takes a few minutes to read. Did the authors believe they were writing for the ages, that they were on the stage of history?
I think in a general sense, the American revolutionaries, both in 1776 and then again when the Constitution's written and adopted in the late 1780s, were deeply conscious that they were on a great historical mission and had an opportunity, which the Declaration itself expresses, to do fundamental acts that would be worthy of historical scrutiny should they succeed. Of course, the great question mark in 1776 is whether or not the cause of independence was going to succeed or not. I mean, had the revolution failed, had the Howe brothers been more ambitious in their military strategy in 1776, had they crushed the rebellion, the American movement towards independence would still be an interesting event, but it would not have the world historical significance it acquired later. But yes, they were certainly mindful, as the Declaration itself says, they were mindful of public opinion, or you could say world opinion, or at least Atlantic opinion at the time. And I think in their more ambitious moments, they did think they were conducting what could be a world historical experience.
Because the ideological or philosophical, as you put it, language in the document isn't there by accident. Jefferson and his compatriots were students of the Enlightenment, at least many of them, not necessarily classical antiquity, as Bernard Bailyn pointed out, that maybe some of them had superficial understanding of classical antiquity, but the real motivation was John Locke, natural rights, and Enlightenment thought. But as you say in your book, they didn't really talk about that at the Congress. That was kind of a given, right?
They had other things on their minds.
Yeah, they weren't debating philosophy in Philadelphia, yet that language, of course, doesn't just wind up in there by accident. Do you want to...
Yeah, but, Martin, I would say they were deeply knowledgeable in the classics. I mean, they were educated in that way. They thought of antiquity as a source of potential lessons, the same way Machiavelli had back in the early 16th century, the way Montesquieu had, a few decades before the Revolution. Bailyn said he got into a lot of trouble with the classicists because he said the lessons they learned from the classics were not as important as classicists like to assume. But that's different from saying that they didn't know the classics. Many of them were very well read, and they could do it like Madison and Hamilton. They could do it in the Greek, and John Adams. They could do it in the Greek and the Latin. They didn't have to rely on translations.
Overstatement on my part there. And obviously Jefferson knew the classics. Well, here's Bailyn, page 26 of the book, The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution. The classics of the ancient world are everywhere in the literature of the Revolution, but they are everywhere illustrative, not determinative of thought?
Well, I think what Balin meant, Balin's point was not just to understand what were the different intellectual sources of the political beliefs of the American revolutionaries, but also to ask which set of beliefs were most influential, most important in terms of shaping their decisions. And that's what ideological origins does, and what I think a lot of readers don't fully understand. The themes that Balin emphasized, particularly the so-called radical or Commonwealth Whig tradition, with its emphasis on the corruption of executive power, the corruption of parliament, and so on. That provided a blueprint, Balin said at one point, a switchboard. It gave the American revolutionaries, at least the revolutionary leaders, a method of analyzing and explaining why the British were doing what they were doing. Knowledge of the classics would not enable you to do that kind of political analysis. The other kinds of beliefs, in that sense, were instrumentally more important.
They weren't trying to create a new Sparta in the American
Well, actually,
colonies.
Samuel Adams said at one point he imagined Boston as a Christian Sparta.
Okay, well, there you go.
But he realized that was he says that in 1780, but he realized that was probably a naive thought on his part.
If not impossible. The name of this series is Our Radical Declaration. Part 1, Sean Wilentz and Jim Oakes were my guests, and we actually mentioned something that you have written, and you are the right guy to ask this question. Wasn't the Declaration, really the revolution, a radical event? You've said to me it holds a primordial place in our collective consciousness, but you've also written that the founders, or I should say the authors of the document, the revolutionaries at the Continental Congress, were not making a statement about individual liberties. They were saying rather that Americans as a people were entitled to the same rights to self-government as other nations. But even as they were writing that, for instance, opponents of slavery, both black and white, were being inspired by the principles of the revolution, the egalitarianism to challenge slavery, for instance.
There are two arguments being made here. The argument I make as a political historian is that, the real purpose of the Declaration was to, in effect, say that, we're going ahead with the project of political independence. To secure that project, we need an alliance and support from foreign nations, France being far and away the most important. We need to organize new governments, including not just constitutions at the state level, but articles of confederation to give the national government a working framework of union. So the right of equality that was first and foremost on the mind of Thomas Jefferson and all his colleagues in the Continental Congress was the collective right of Americans as a people, having been subjected to a long train of abuse of their liberties, to finally throw off the yoke of obedience to King George III and the British Empire that he represented, and to secure among the nations of the earth the lawful place to which Americans were entitled. So when Jefferson says all men are created equal, neither he nor the colleagues around him were asking the question, are we going to make some notion of civic individual equality the dominant value in American political culture for decades and generations to come? That was not the issue that was on their mind. They had many more pressing concerns. But of course, the language is there.
Yes.
I'm not sure you date a radical reading of the preamble, the opening sentences of the Declaration. I'm not sure you date it quite to 1776. By the time you get to the 1790s, one, for example, the first federal Congress under the Constitution starts debating the anti-slavery petitions that came in from the Pennsylvania, from
Quakers.
The Quakers and the Pennsylvania, Abolition Society. That kind of popular reading of the Declaration, the idea that the equality we're talking about, it's not just about Americans as a people, it's about Americans as individuals, and perhaps independent of race, class, gender, sexual orientation, and so on. That possibility was there from the beginning.
Agreed. Do you agree with Gordon Wood, who wrote in his... Got another classic here, Jack. The Radicalism of the American Revolution. This one was published, I believe, in the 90s. He wrote, "The revolution did more than legally create the United States. It transformed American society. Far from remaining monarchical, hierarchy-ridden subjects on the margin of civilization, Americans had become almost overnight the most liberal, the most democratic, the most commercially minded, and the most modern people in the world." He says these changes were radical and they were extensive. A shorter way of putting it is Americans now view themselves as citizens rather than subjects. Yeah. Do you think Wood's analysis holds up?
Well, Gordon left a manuscript for that book on my doorstep
That's
after
right, you mentioned
spending a
that
year
to
at
me.
Stanford in the late 1980s. In fact, I think we celebrated my 40th birthday together,
Wow.
along with our spouses, my wife Helen and his wife Louise. So, I read that book in manuscript. I had a few comments on it. I basically agree with it. I mean, Gordon's book is not popular with a number of scholars, and it's a
Why?
brilliantly.
Is it because there's a more pessimistic and cynical view of the founding today?
Well, I wouldn't say pessimistic and cynical, though. Though you can certainly use those adjectives. The couple of demerits of Gordon's approach. One is, in that whole book, Gordon has very little to say about slavery. I think many scholars have always seen that as a kind of gap or a weakness in his work. And Gordon is in many ways a patriot historian. I'm not sure I know what Gordon's politics are. Gordon's a good friend of mine, but we've never had close political discussions, and I couldn't actually say what his political beliefs are. I think the critical thing about the Radicalism book, he doesn't talk about social change in the objective sense of the term. He doesn't talk about the redistribution of property and the kinds of things we often think about. Certainly, we think about the French Revolution, or more to the point, modern revolutions. But Gordon is very much imbued with, it's kind of almost a Montesquieuian notion. What were the dominant principles of the three successive regimes he sees as being monarchical, republican, and then democratic? And it's the birth of a truly democratic culture, the kind of thing that Tocqueville would try to make sense of a few decades later, that really animates Gordon's concern. And for a lot of people who want to emphasize American society, that's not good enough.
It's interesting. Well, you wrote, I should say, again, way back in 1979. One thing I do find fascinating about talking to scholars on my podcast is when they say that they've changed their mind since they wrote something. So you can tell me if your interpretation has changed since you wrote this book. You're talking about the decision. I mean, these are more the pragmatic, prosaic concerns rather than the lofty ideology, right? You say by early 76, meaning 1776, it took little ingenuity to demonstrate that the colonies could now rightfully renounce their subjection to the mother country. Precisely because this conclusion seemed self-evident, Congress spent little time pondering the principles and charges that Jefferson eventually enumerated in the Declaration. What did trouble the delegates were more pragmatic questions about the necessity, utility, and timing of a formal declaration. So the crisis had been going on for years. Crown authority had collapsed in many places by now. The war was underway. Rebellion is fully underway. But they're not independent yet, or they're not stating their independence yet, because there's a chance for reconciliation. But my takeaway from your book is the terms that the reconcilers, or the moderates as you call them, wanted from the Crown would never have been granted. So in a sense, they were as radical as the radicals.
I might not agree fully with that position, but
Well, you wrote the book, so you can definitely correct my interpretation of it.
Well, I think I think I say two things. I mean, one is decision making in the Continental Congress, going back to actually the first Continental Congress of September, October 1774, was essentially consensual in nature. It wasn't a matter of one side, whipping the votes and getting to some kind of working majority, however you wanted to define a working majority. Decision-making was consensual, meaning that everyone had to agree in a general way that this is what we need to do now because this is what circumstances dictate. By the time you get to the mid to late winter, well, really even the early winter of 1776, between the news from London, the publication of Common Sense. I don't think Common Sense did much to affect the delegates' thinking, but did have a significant impact on public opinion. And that, in a sense, gets me to the second variable. So one variable here is the delegations, or the members of the Continental Congress, have to reach a kind of general level of agreement about what decision is appropriate at this particular moment. And they do that, I think, primarily in terms of their response to what the British are doing. And when Parliament passes the Prohibitory Act, making all American commerce subject, where the king gives a fiery speech, when he says all Americans are rebels, and I think perhaps most important, the American moderates were desperate to see peace commissioners with genuine authority, real authority to negotiate, being appointed and probably sent to America. I mean, they had previously debated, should we send our own peace commission to London? They decided back in mid-1775, they decided not to do that. But the moderates, people like John Jay, Robert Morris, Governor Morris, James Wilson, John Dickinson, they were desperate to negotiate, but the British had to take the first initiative to do that. So the longer this goes on without any sign of that happening, the easier it becomes, or the more you remove the obstacles.
Public opinion too, right?
Right.
Really important here.
Well, and then you're right, Martin. The second big variable is public opinion, and I think the public opinion matters most is really in the what we call the middle states. That's to say, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey to some extent. You can include Delaware, but Delaware is only 3 counties. These are the counties where sociologically, demographically, were in a sense the most diverse, most pluralistic, as we use that term for American history. So there were some existing divisions in the body politic. I mean, Quakers and also Anglicans. Quakers have their own hangups, and Anglicans have deeper notions of loyalty to the crown because they are the official state church and so on. Those were waiting to become convinced that public opinion was shifting decisively or significantly in favor of independence. So I think those are the principal hedges. The moderates are waiting for commissioners. There's no evidence the British are backing away from their policy. And all the delegates are trying to monitor as best they could the progress of public opinion. What happens in the spring of 1776, and my late friend Pauline Mayer emphasized this point, though I think I also made it in my own book, that in the spring of 1776, you have all these county meetings taking place across America, which are effectively, adopting resolutions saying, the time has come. That's a kind of crude measure of public opinion, but it does suggest this is the way that public sentiment is moving in favor of independence. So once that evidence is there, it became much easier.
You're referring to the states forming their own governments, new governments.
Well, that's part of the process. Yeah. I mean, Virginia starts writing its constitution in May the Fifth Provincial Convention, which met in May 1776. Of course, Virginia's the largest and still the most populous state. Other states are starting to do that. There was a time John Adams had said at one point that maybe there should be a sequence to how we do this. Let's write state constitutions, let's have Articles of Confederation, then let's go get a foreign treaty. But in effect, by the late spring of 1776, let's say late May, early June, the delegates realized we just have to do all these 3 things at once. There's no point having a sequence. We just have to move forward collectively and do all these things simultaneously or concurrently.
Adams was always a pain in the neck,
Yeah, I'm more of a Madison guy. Madison never liked John Adams. And Jefferson, liked him much more. But of course, they had their big falling out that, had to be patched up by Benjamin Rush eventually.
I'm more of a Jefferson person, mostly because I admire Jefferson's mind. But Madison had an amazing mind as well. So, it's easy to look back on these events and read them as everything pointing toward independence, because that's what we know what happened, right? Rather than contingency that maybe might have gone another way, right? There could have been a reconciliation, although, again, based on the terms that even the moderate colonists were demanding, the Crown and Parliament were in no mood to give them. Really what I'm trying to get at here is Continental Congress meets for the first time in autumn of 1774, and it takes all the way till summer of 1776 to declare independence. But, that's really not a lot of time, especially since news moved so slowly in those days. You could look at it this way. It happened pretty quickly.
I tend to agree. I mean, it's, as I say, the crisis of independence goes essentially from May 1774, when the news of the Boston Port Act, the second week of May, news of the Boston Port Act, which is a response to the Boston Tea Party, reaches American harbors. And then, let's say to June, early July 1776, when all the decisions are being taken. There is an initial waiting period between, late October 1774, when the First Continental Congress adjourned, and then April, May 1775, when war breaks out in Massachusetts, and then the Continental Congress gets together and has a debate that actually very few scholars, other than myself, have looked at it very carefully. We really only have one source for it, the diary of Silas Deane, who was a delegate from Connecticut. In the aftermath of the outbreak of war, Senate Continental Congress in its early weeks does have a pretty open-ended debate, and I think a somewhat stormy debate, as to should we revise our objectives, our plans. In the end, they decide effectively to stand pat. They agreed to send a second olive branch petition, to Britain, but the first one hadn't gotten them anywhere. The king had essentially ignored it. And, Martin, I think that gets me, to me, I think the most important point of all, and the best way of explaining the revolution, is not to account for what the Americans were doing. It's to account for what the British were doing or failing to do. I mean, because it seems to me from the very beginning, if you go back to the winter of 1774, The whole British strategy, with the adoption of the so-called coercive or intolerable acts, starting with the Boston Port Act, the whole British strategy was to try to isolate Massachusetts, get Massachusetts to toe the line and teach a lesson to all the other colonies. When the first Continental Congress met and what had reached agreement on its basic objectives and its basic strategy, that strategy had already failed. But what do the British do? Instead of recognizing that their assumptions were mistaken, they effectively doubled down on it. They put Thomas Gage, the last governor of Massachusetts, and the commander of British forces. They put a lot of pressure on Gage to start trying to engage the colonists militarily. You have to remember, Gage was bottled up in Boston. And Boston in 1775 is it's a town at the end of a very narrow peninsula. Yeah. So you can occupy Boston, that's fine, but you're kind of stuck there. It's not, you can't move around in the countryside very freely. So Gage is put under a lot of pressure. And what happens? The war starts. And then now as the war starts, the Americans, do pretty well in sending the British back to Boston. They do pretty well at, the battle we call Bunker's Hill. And they start to organize an army. And the British, they refuse to recognize the Congress. They refuse to recognize the provincial governments. They refuse to recognize the shift in political authority that's taken place. And so in a sense, that's why I think by the summer of 1775, though, Martin, go back to your original point, it's still going to take a whole other year for independence to take place. The basic structure is there. And it's a matter of kind of waiting for the different boxes to be checked or different milestones or waystones to be passed. Yeah, I think it's the British obstinacy strikes me. You could say British stupidity strikes me as, the most interesting variable in the equation.
If you can get something close to independence without having to fight a horrible war against a powerful opponent, maybe you'll try and try again. As you say, all the olive branch petitions they weren't even countenanced, right? But there wasn't one tipping point in the summer of 76 or two or three, precipitating events necessarily. It was an accumulation of things where finally now, okay, we've exhausted the options. Let's go ahead and do this. I mean, that's my reading of your book.
Yeah, and I think you could also say, there's a kind of imperative sense. Once you're convinced there's no prospect for reconciliation, or the chances of peace commissioners with real authority coming over is in the slim to nil to -1 range.
And the British are already sending 30,000 troops over too. So
right, and proving the point. The obvious inference is we need foreign support. So that's why, again, this is a political, this is not a philosophical explanation of independence or the philosophy of the Declaration, and it doesn't require talking too much about natural rights and so on.
I mean, are you trying to say that Adams didn't throw a book across the Congress, the desk at Jefferson saying, no, it's Montesquieu, and, no, it's Descartes. No, will you grab that edition of John Locke over there?
Yeah,
no.
Yeah. Well, I think it's very clear. I think Locke was important. I mean, the opening of the Declaration distinctly echoes Locke, the idea of a long train of abuses. Locke assumed, as Jefferson did, that people were more inclined to, suffer under some set of abuses than immediately take the active steps necessary. So by the time that people are ready to rebel or psychologically ready to rebel, it must mean the long train of abuses has actually existed, has actually occurred.
So, Jack Rakove, for most of my life anyway, the American Revolution was a source not necessarily of unity, right? We've always debated the meaning of the revolution as Americans. But it's really an origin story. I mean, this is how I viewed it. An origin story that served as a universal source of inspiration. All of our egalitarian ideals, as Gordon Wood has written, and our egalitarian language stem from the revolutionary era, the natural rights ideology. However, I don't know if you're noticing this. I'll get to my question eventually. If the revolution had always been a source of at least common inspiration, Martin Luther King, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the Declaration of Independence is even quoted verbatim by Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam in 1945. It was the Civil War and its aftermath that divided us. Not the revolution. But do you see that changing now? Is the revolution and this pro-slavery revolution argument that's out there, is it becoming a source of division now too?
There are the interesting debates surrounding Project 1619, about which I've written a little myself. I mean, in general, I support the aims of the project. I think their story about the revolution and its relationship to chattel slavery is badly flawed, really, for all the reasons I discussed in our interview and at greater length in my book. It's just, the Americans did not revolt in 1776 in order to protect chattel slavery. I think the best way to put this is to say, and I think many scholars would agree on this, is to say that Americans have had two foundings. And this is a common theme in the literature. I think it unites many historians and many constitutional scholars. And so you have to attach enormous significance to the Reconstruction amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and their impact on our notions of equality. I mean, I think the best way to put it is to say that whatever is his original intention or the political objectives of his colleagues in Congress, when the Declaration says all men are created equal, each of us as Americans is equally free to read that statement as we want to read it. And I think the decisive fact about equality, it's an inherently corrosive topic. That's to say, it's corrosive not of itself, but of hierarchies which might have seemed perfectly natural at T sub 1. But once you make a notion of equality, once you bring a notion of equality, individual equality to bear on it, things we took for granted as just part of the order of things now become suspect. That doesn't depend upon Jefferson's, intellect or the significance of the revolution. It really depends upon, the idea that equality itself is an extremely powerful, but also deeply subversive ideal. And Americans have appropriated it for multiple purposes in our history.
But I sense that people, at least in my experience, for what that's worth, people on the left, and I don't just get this from my interactions with people in real life, as they say, I see this on social media too, especially younger liberals or leftists, kind of giving up on that progressive tradition. All men are created equal, that the Declaration and the Revolution are supposed to be, our source of inspiration to make a better society. It wasn't a reflection of reality at the time. The whole point is that this is something we aspire to today. We've never really achieved social equality in our country anyway. But in the eyes of many people, things are not going very well in our country. Politics seem too slow or ineffective, and the revolutionary egalitarian principles were a lie. You hear that type of thing. I don't agree with that attitude, but it's out there.
Well, I think the egalitarian principles are things that, I think, as I was just trying to say, they're not static. They weren't entrenched in some rigid form in 1776 or 1787 or 89 or 1865 or whatever. I mean, equality is, as I try to suggest, it's a very dynamic, it's very appealing, and it's a very dynamic idea. And so it has to have its own history. I think historically, I think the point I've tried to make elsewhere is that historically, I think over the long course, the revolution has been seen as a source of national unity. And the Civil War, by definition, is the opposite. And then, of course, you get the flourishing, what's called the so-called lost cause ideology or mythology in Southern culture, which became so important in the late 19th and early 20th century. So it's tied to the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and all those Confederate monuments and flying the Confederate flag still.
And textbooks as well, and the history profession too.
And the war over textbooks.
The Dunning School.
But scholars think history is too important to be left to the politicians.
I think of Dr. Strangelove when I hear that famous quote. I think it was General Jack Ripper, played by Sterling Hayden, talking to Group Captain Lionel Mandrake, played by Peter Sellers. He quotes Clemenceau. Remember what Clemenceau said about war?
Mandrake, do you recall what Clemenceau once said about war?
No, I didn't think I do, son, no.
He said war was too important to be left to the generals. When he said that, 50 years ago, he might have been right. But today, war is too important to be left to politicians.
All right. We'll do movie criticism later on. Speaking of the so-called pro-slavery revolution, which is not accurate, I had an aha moment reading your book here. Tucked away on page 66 is a quote from Governor Dunmore on Christmas Eve, 1774. He's complaining how he's already lost the colony. So this idea that the Dunmore Proclamation was a tipping point toward, rebellion or independence is, Well, it's nonsense because Dunmore himself was,
Right.
proclaiming in order to try to win the colony back.
I mean, Gunmore's trying to govern Virginia from a ship cruising up and down
Yes.
the Chesapeake Bay. It's not. I mean, I've cruised up and down the Chesapeake Bay a couple times on Stanford alumni trips. It's a nice sail, but it's it's not the best way to govern a colony. I mean, the crucial point to make is that British rule collapsed in America between the summer fall of 1774 and certainly by the summer of 1775. In a couple colonies, New Jersey, New York, the legislature did continue to meet, but even there were provincial conventions, which represented, in effect, were surrogate legislatures to organize revolutionary activity. There was never, except when the British Army was physically occupying a particular community, or for that matter, a colony, and particularly 1780, 1781 in the South, there was never a point when, if the British Army wasn't there, there are no parts of the former American colonial community that swing back into allegiance.
That's right.
I mean, British Army could in a sense liberate particular areas, but if they didn't keep their own troops there, they didn't really have enough loyalist soldiers.
Well, the Eastern Seaboard's an enormous piece of geography. The British did occupy every major American city, and we're talking about major cities. They were small provincial towns, really. But I mentioned 30,000 troops arriving early in the war. I don't know off the top of my head the total number of British and mercenary forces that fought for the crown in the Revolutionary War. But by, modern counterinsurgency standards, they didn't nearly have enough to win the war. As you say, as soon as they left an area, it fell back into Patriot hands. That Dunmore quote I mentioned, he's complaining how the colonists are showing more respect to the provincial or the revolutionary legislatures than they ever showed their rightful government, the crown government.
Right. He wasn't alone in that. You get that. The same comment comes from a number of the royal governors in the period, really, from after the spring of 1774. They all say pretty much the same thing, that these surrogate institutions, the revolutionary committees, conventions, congresses, whatever you want to call them, have as effective governing power as any legal institution has ever exercised before. I mean, the only qualm is if you're part of that revolutionary apparatus, you have to bring Americans as a whole to the point of independence, and that remains a bit of a struggle or a bit of a waiting game.
So, Jack, I'm holding in my hands a massive tome called The Last King of America, written by Andrew Roberts. It's a fairly favorable biography of George III. He writes, this is Roberts, not the king. The Declaration of Independence is simultaneously grotesquely hypocritical, illogical, mendacious, and sublime. I don't know. I think that's a little much.
He's over the top. Well,
yeah.
Well, Roberts is, a British Tory of both the old, I suppose, of both the old and the new schools. The key thing to be said about George III is, he wasn't a tyrant. I mean, he was doing the best he could to be a constitutional monarch within his legitimate understanding of what that entailed. I think one of the hardest things to explain about the revolution, and actually Woody Holton in his book, Liberty is Sweet, gets this wrong. George III was still he's a constitutional monarch. He's still an active player in British governance. He's not just a figurehead monarch. He's not just there to kind of read a speech to Parliament or to dress up in those crazy robes they still like to wear instead of business suits. I mean, George III was an active player, and his preferences for who would be a minister, were still an important variable. I think it's very hard for Americans to understand it because the British monarchy, was still in a process of constitutional evolution. It'd be very different in the 19th century, in part because of George III's eventual, mental illness in the Regency period. When you get to the 19th century, the parliamentary forces are even stronger then than they've been in the 18th century, and monarchy itself, notwithstanding all our fascination with Queen Victoria as an institution of governance, although not trivial, is much weaker than it had been previously. But George III was an active king, so he is in a certain sense a British decision maker. When word came of the fall of Yorktown, Frederick Lord North, who had been George's longtime, first minister, really wanted to resign, but he noted that the king himself felt that he should abdicate. That it was his, that somehow he and his authority had also suffered defeat, and North, in fact, I won't say convinces, but he kind of persuades, has to persuade the king that no, it's fine, perfectly fine for you to stay in power as a constitutional monarch of the kind we imagine you to be.
Well, he was an imperialist, right? So when his colonies are trying to secede, he tries to stop that secession with the use of force. And, he may have shown more flexibility than the ministry or parliament early on in the crisis, but once he decided to put his foot down, he was unbending about that. And he did declare the colonists to be an open rebellion in 1775, and that news reached the Congress in Philadelphia a few months later. So about the
One of the great counterfactuals, what would have happened if George III got on a ship and made a tour of the colonies?
Yeah.
And, who knows? Who knows?
Never
But
visited them.
it's kind of fun to think about it.
Yeah,
I mean,
he was German, so he could have left the UK and come to the colonies. So about the grievances, Jack, Denver Brunsman told me that historians are spending more time teaching about the grievances rather than the soaring opening third of the Declaration of Independence. Is that right?
Yeah, I think historians, I think it's more the political philosophers who want to just stop at the first natural right Lockean section of it. The grievances, they do provide a kind of convenient framework to think about the underlying structure of imperial government and the things that Americans represented. They are a bit of a laundry list, a kind of a catalog of different complaints the Americans had felt. I think the important thing to note is that collectively, since the Americans had always denied that they could be properly under the jurisdiction of Parliament, except in a limited number of cases relating mostly to imperial commerce. If you want to declare independence, the king is the dominant link, and arguably I won't say the sole link, but it's certainly the dominant link, primary link, in the overall theory of empire. So if you want to become an independent nation in the way that the opening paragraph of the Declaration suggests, that's the last link that has to be severed. Why? Because the Americans had always denied that they were subject to parliamentary jurisdiction, except in particular handful of cases that they were prepared to concede. You did need one central authority, and there was no better claimant to that authority than Parliament.
The king had been a personally popular figure too, prior to all this stuff.
Yeah, so they say. I think Americans had seen his coronation portrait, which still hangs, and a lot of when you go to England, still hangs in a lot of places.
And they still dress up in those funny costumes when they need to do a new pageant or whatever that is. So I think the 27th or is there 28? I always forget. 27 or 20, I can just count them. I have the document right in front of me. It's the last grievance that gets a lot of attention now, and this has led some folks who are on the Dunmore bandwagon in a wrong direction historically. It reads, he, meaning the king, has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. But as Roberts, the Tory, points out, this was an ex post facto justification for a revolution that was already underway, and that goes for several of the last grievances there. Do you agree with that?
Well, it is right. It is a response to conditions arising from the war itself. So, it's fair to say that the fear of slave rebellion Dunmore seemed to be contributing to, was a long-standing concern, we could say obsession, in Southern plantation society. Indian warfare, the crimes and atrocities that the Americans attribute to Native American peoples were the same crimes and atrocities that Euro-Americans perpetrated, and you could say perpetuated against Native populations. So, you could say that argument could cut both ways. More basic point there is that those two items are responses to the conditions created by the Revolutionary War itself. I mean, I will say that I spent some time looking at this for other reasons later. Is the Americans did make what I think were, in a sense, good faith efforts to tell Native American peoples, this was not their fight, and they would do better to sit this struggle out rather than to align themselves with the British. And, we sometimes suppose, and I think this is, to my way of thinking, this is somewhat problematic, that, the proclamation of 1763, the idea of creating a boundary between European settlement and native settlement represented some lasting solution or lasting way of thinking about the relationship between the Aboriginal peoples and the colonizing peoples. I'm not convinced of that. I mean, I think the pressures to expand, to create, what we now call, a settler society in British North America would have been pretty inexorable one way or another. So that I wouldn't want to confuse what was a response to the kind of the immediate issues of the 1760s with a long-term policy for how to deal with Native peoples.
The 1763 proclamation line, that was the same king. After the war, the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, which really lasted longer than 7 years, didn't it? But anyway,
Right.
it's a line on a map saying that British or colonial expansion can't go beyond this line to the west because, you would incite conflict with the Native American peoples there, and the British didn't have the military forces in place to, referee that, if you will.
Well, actually, they did have some, but it's precisely because it was so expensive to maintain them on the frontier that they wanted to bring them back to the seaboard, which in a certain sense is how you wind up with the Boston Massacre.
Yeah, there you go. So, final question, Jack Rakove. How do you think people should revisit the subject of the Declaration of Independence?
I suppose I have two comments. One is that language, for whatever purposes Jefferson and his colleagues adopted it, the language of equality remains as formidable in American culture today as it has been historically, pretty much throughout our history. Let's say at least since the 1790s, which is a fairly long time ago now. So you can't deny its importance. I think the other thing to think about today, you can think about this in terms of Russia and Ukraine. I mean, the Declaration of Independence effectively justifies a war of national liberation, and it's predicated upon a people's ability, capacity to identify itself collectively as a people. The disparaging way in which, the spokesman, for Putin's regime dismissed the Ukrainians, really, according to many commentators, the incitements to genocide that mark Russian rhetoric in the last few years, you have to be juxtaposed against the Ukrainians' idea that they have built their own political community. They are mobilizing massively to sustain and protect it. They're doing so in the face of what would seem to be an arbitrary and very dangerous tyranny. So that's another kind of the global scale to think about just linking the revolution. Of course, that's a part of David Armitage's book about the Declaration of Independence and the fact that Ho Chi Minh said it. So you could say, Ho Chi Minh was basically Stalin's man in Indochina. Yeah. He went back in Indochina, in order to purge, Communist Party of its deviance, and he helped to create a kind of Stalinist regime, that still exists there on the one hand. On the other hand, Ho Chi Minh was a cosmopolitan character. He'd been in the United States. He'd been a merchant seaman. He'd been a pastry chef under Escoffier in London.
Yeah, he was at Versailles. We said that same time.
When the treaty was negotiated, so he was a much more worldly figure than many Vietnamese intellectuals were. And I'm not wholly convinced that his use of the Declaration was merely cynical or just another form of commie agitprop.
Yeah, well, after the French were done with their nightmare there in Vietnam, he had the Geneva Accords, I think, in 1954, after Dien Bien Phu. There were supposed to be elections in Vietnam, and the reason why the United States blocked them is because Eisenhower and company understood Ho Chi Minh would win. He was the most popular political figure in the country at that time.
Yeah, have you ever been to Hanoi?
I have not, no.
Oh, because it's interesting to visit the quarters he retired to.
Oh, wow.
Of course, he was kind of, in a certain sense, he was marginalized within the leadership.
That's right. He was very old by the time.
He was their senior figure, an object of public worship, but not politically, not the most important decision maker.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, our series on the Declaration continues, and our guests will be Joseph Ellis and Annette Gordon-Reed. Can't wait. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.